Thank you. And my topic for today is on regulation. Regulation is a very broad topic. Just trying to give you a flavor of some of the areas that you'll encounter regulation when you come into Canada and specifically in North America in general. Jeff said earlier that we have a saying in North America that there are two certainties, death and taxes. There's a third, regulation, and we also have another saying, and that is the devil's in the details, and that's pretty much the area of regulation. Now, in regulation, I'm going to cover some of the broad topics, but there's also much regulation that goes on with respect to specific industries. It doesn't make sense to cover them all now because we'd be going on forever, but um, so we're covering the general topics here. But before you start doing business in Canada, you should make sure that you speak to somebody that will give you some assistance in determining what regulations apply that are specific to your business and to your industry. Now, regulation in Canada happens over a number of different under a number of different jurisdictions. The federal government is involved naturally, so is the provincial government. But we also find a lot of regulation that's applicable to business at the municipal level, and then oftentimes at the industry association level. And industry associations can be the regulators themselves. They can be a facilitator to comply with regulation, or they can be a teacher as to how to what regulations apply, how they're interpreted, and how they're dealt with by the various members in the industry. The regulation, as I said, is from every level, and it's important to have the proper guidance. And one of the reasons is that regulations can differ from province to province and from the federal government to the provincial government, not only in the types of regulations or what they're regulating, but oftentimes about the interpretation and about the enforcement or the practices surrounding regulation. So local knowledge is key here. And if there's anything you should take away from this talk, it's that when you come into a new area, take the time to get to know and to understand the regulation that applies as it pertains to that particular part of the world. Many industries, as I was saying, have specific regulation. Those would include, some of the examples would include medical devices, agriculture, agribusiness, transportation, communication, that sort of thing. So I'm going to talk about a few general areas: product liability, packaging and labeling, privacy, environmental, and labor employment or employer-employee relationships. With respect to product liability, by that I mean liability that you would have to purchasers and users of the products that you either sell or that you manufacture. That's an area that's covered by both the federal and provincial governments, sometimes municipal, but mostly federal and provincial. There's some provincial legislation that implies statutory warranties of quality and of fitness or of performance of a product. And sometimes this can be contracted out of, but sometimes not. So it's important to understand that as you go forward. Manufacturers in Canada have post-sale common law duty, so a law that's imposed by the courts rather than coming out of statute, to warn consumers about defects or dangers that become known to the manufacturer after the product has hit the market. The vehicles, for example, if there's a defect that's discovered that wasn't known when the vehicle was made, but is discovered later, there's an obligation on the part of the car manufacturer to tell the public, tell the consumers that are driving those cars. As well, recklessly or carelessly making false statements, so false advertising or false claims in your sales force about a product's safety or utility can attract liability. And as well, there's in Canada we have historically been less litigious than our neighbors to the south. We do not have jury trials as a general rule. They're far less common in any event, and punitive damages are not as available in Canada as in the United States. There has been lately legislation that has allowed, and we've seen the development of class action litigation. Now, that's a new concept in Canada. It's not in the United States or other jurisdictions, but it is a new area for Canada. It remains to be seen how that's going to affect our legal landscape. And with respect to packaging and labeling, just some general points. Again, both federal and provincial governments wade into this area. There's packaging to consumers have some specific requirements, including requirements as to the common name and using the common name of the product, the quality, the quantity, the manufacturer's name, rules with respect to placement of that information, type, size being used. Sometimes packaging as well. We get into issues of safety packaging if the product is volatile or something like that. And there's weights and measures requirements as well. In Canada, we use the metric system, although you can usually also put on the imperial system if you want, but the metric system must be there. Statutorily required information generally must be in both English and French. There are some exceptions, but not many. French, of course, is the other official language of Canada. And many producers, manufacturers, sellers follow the practice of just making sure that everything on the package is bilingual. That may not always be required, but it has become the norm in many industries. Country of origin is required on many products, and as well there's special regulations with respect to certain industries, certain products, food, drugs, medical devices, things like that. Privacy is an area that will vary from country to country quite a bit. Canada is no exception. It is an area that is usually it's either federal or provincial. The federal statute provides that it takes priority over specific federally regulated industries. And it also says that it applies where there is a lack of provincial legislation. In Manitoba, for example, we use the federal act, but in certain other provinces they have a provincial act that applies rather than the federal. Typically, this privacy legislation applies to, or personal information applies to the collection and retention, use and disclosure of personal information in commercial activities. So there's a couple of key terms there. One is personal versus public. So personal information, personal does not include corporations. So information about corporations may not be protected. But personal members of the public, individual consumers, it certainly does apply. In commercial activities, most businesses' activities are commercial, but not always. So you have to look at the definition, look at the activity in place, and question whether or not it is actually a commercial activity. In Canada, you'll need to adopt a privacy policy, disclose how you're going to collect, use, and distribute and protect private information, appoint privacy officers, obtain consents for use of the information, etc. Environmental regulation is an area that you'll see the federal, provincial, and municipal governments wade into. This area is often complex, and often the regulation in this area is vague, leaving a lot to interpretation to the regulators. Consequently, approaches will vary between the federal, provincial, and municipal governments, and often it'll vary between provinces. For example, Manitoba has often taken an approach that is that will assist people in industry to come into compliance, whereas other governments in Canada will take the approach that if you're in breach of the statute, then they should ticket you or charge you, and then deal with you later. So Manitoba is a little bit more cooperative in many areas. But so just because you have the same requirement in one area doesn't mean it's going to be enforced or interpreted the same in another. In environmental concerns or environmental regulations, particularly so. Um, I won't go through all the various areas, but um, some of the areas involve pollution, contamination of soil, hazardous material, protection of species and habitats, and then there's a lot with respect to specific products, chemicals, dangerous goods, that sort of thing. The last one that I'll cover, but certainly not the last one that there is, employer-employee relationships. That's primarily a provincial area, except with respect to certain national industries where the federal government will take priority. In Canada, we have minimum standards, things like minimum wages, hours of work, statutory holidays, vacations, minimum vacation periods, maternity leave, parental leave requirements, and also with respect to things such as human rights, respecting human rights, workers' compensation legislation, unionized work, that sort of thing. And as well, termination of employment is a big area and something that will vary from different country to different country. In Canada, we do not have employment at will, like in some jurisdictions, and there is, even in the absence of a specific written agreement, there is usually a requirement that employers provide notice or payment in lieu of notice when they are terminating employees without cause. And cause can be very narrowly defined at times. A written employment contract is not usually required in Canada, but in many cases it may be recommended. The list in employment goes on and on, unionized labor, and many other areas. So, lastly, and just to sum up, again, I stress that it's important to get good advice, local advice, about what regulation applies to you and your industry in the areas that you see yourself doing business in Canada. And I'd like to thank you for your time and have a great day.